This is Dilip, and welcome to another episode of Dr. Dilip's MMS Weekly. And this week we are going to discuss about some few of the modes of mechanical ventilation. Actually, this is a 4 to 5 part video lecture, not a single lecture, like 2 3 hours one. So we'll be discussing the basic modes and the basic ventilator mechanisms in 4 to 5 part lecture. So in the first part, we are going to discuss on probably number one, indications of mechanical ventilation. Number two, probably what is the difference between oxygenation and ventilation. And number three, we might be discussing on few areas about the basic curves in the ventilator. So what are the curves that form the basics of a ventilator? So these are three things. These are the objectives of today's video. Let us see the first one. Let us see the indications of mechanical ventilation. So whenever you think about the indications of mechanical ventilation, the first thing that comes into our mind is the perioperative status, obviously. Many surgeries need general anesthesia in that you need, obviously, a mechanical ventilator to be operated in place. And number two, in ICUs, in many times in cases of respiratory failure, you obviously need a mechanical ventilation. So again, like the basic two types of respiratory failure will be a type 1 respiratory failure or a type 2 respiratory failure. In a type 1 respiratory failure, you tend to call it as hypoxemic respiratory failure. And in type 2 respiratory failure, you call it as hypercapnic respiratory failure. So hypoxemic respiratory failure where there is low PaO2, and in hypercapnic respiratory failure where there is more PaCO2. Because of that, you have a low PaO2. So in both these conditions, you have low PaO2 status. That is what all about respiratory failure is. And number three, if you want to ask any patient with a altered mental status, AMS, obviously you have to ventilate these patients. I'll tell you why. Number four, so certain times, for example, if there is very high metabolic demands, especially in septic patients, just to meet the extremely high metabolic demands, you might need a mechanical ventilator in place. So why we do this? For example, if it's a type 1 respiratory failure, the basic idea is to increase this PaO2. That is what the basic idea is. So here the main idea is oxygenation. So that is why we do a mechanical ventilation. So in a type 2 respiratory failure, the main idea is to bring this PaCO2 back to normal. So here you're going to ventilate the patient. So the ventilation is the basic idea why you do a mechanical ventilation in a type 2 respiratory failure. And in altered mental status, your idea is to protect the airway. So which means that's all. It's quite simple. So there are three most important principles for the indications of mechanical ventilation: oxygenate, ventilate, protect the airway. So that's it. So these are the three basic and main things that you have to know before doing a mechanical ventilation. These are the indications. So how do you protect an airway? So okay, fine. Oxygenation is fine, ventilation is fine, but how do you really, protect an airway? So obviously, many of the endotracheal tubes have something called cuffs, isn't it? So the ET tube cuff. So this cuff actually gets inflated in the trachea. So when you inflate this cuff and when you close the trachea from communicating with outside, atmosphere or some other pharyngeal or esophageal secretions, that's how you protect the airway and you prevent these secretions from getting aspirated. So that is how the ET tube protects the airway. So next thing, so the difference between oxygenation and ventilation. So why? So how do you determine whether your basic idea is oxygenation or ventilation? So first, let us see how can you affect oxygenation in a ventilator and how can you affect ventilation in a ventilator. So the basic idea of oxygenation, I will tell you very simple. It is to increase the PaO2 plus or minus increasing the saturation. So this is what the basic idea of oxygenation is. So the basic idea of ventilation is to reduce the PaCO2. So that is the basic idea of a ventilation is. So what determines your oxygenation? So number one, the most important thing that determines your oxygenation is the fraction of inspired oxygen, which we'll discuss again in the upcoming videos. And number two, the second basic idea of oxygenation is positive end expiratory pressure, which I clearly mentioned in the last video. It's all about alveolar recruitment. So when you recruit more alveoli is available for gas exchange so that you can increase the PaO2 to a little bit higher level. So that is what, these are the two strategies how you do a oxygenation. So how will you ventilate? So the basic idea of ventilation is to reduce the PaCO2. So obviously reducing the PaCO2 in a hypercapnic failure itself will increase the PaO2. Fine. So obviously, how do you do that? How to reduce the PaCO2? Remember, ventilation is totally based on, or the PaCO2 in fact is totally based on something called as minute ventilation. So obviously, what are the things that affect this minute ventilation? There are, whenever you think about minute ventilation, the formula for minute ventilation is something respiratory rate and the tidal volume. So that's it. So this is what like it's all about. So these are the two things that affect the ventilation. So whenever you want to reduce the PaCO2, you have to either increase the like tidal volume, or you have to increase the respiratory rate, which in turn increases the minute ventilation, which can reduce the PaCO2. That is why I told you in the last video, whenever you have an ARDS, when you give a low tidal volume ventilation, there is a lot of possibility that your PaCO2 might increase. So that is what we call it as permissive hypercapnia, which is okay in ARDS, because this high volume is associated with volume. It's going to have a terrible impact on your ARDS lung. So which we all discussed in the last video. So next, the third important thing what you're going to discuss is about the basic ventilator curves. So this is what we are going to discuss in the as a third event, the ventilator curves. So whenever you discuss about the ventilator curves, you have to know about the ventilator I mean, timings and all these things. So usually ventilator, like as a normal breath, ventilator has two things. You have an inspiration and you have an expiration as well. So similarly, let us draw the curves. The curves have a lot of things. For example, curves might have a sinusoidal pattern, or you have a square pattern like this, or it might have a exponential pattern like this. A lot of, things are there about the curves. But like these are the basic curves which I see in my ICU, so that I'm going to use these curves to explain you. So what is really happening? So let us see. First of all, there are three types of curves in the ventilator. First, you have something called a pressure curve. Second one, you have something called a flow curve, and the third one, you have something called a volume curve. So this is what you're going to look out for. So what are all about the pressure curve? So take this one. So this graph. So let us see the pressure curve. So this is the x-axis and the y-axis. So for example, there will be a basic amount of pressure which will be set in the ventilator. That's what we call it as positive end expiratory pressure, or otherwise called as PEEP. So at some point of time, it's going to trigger an inspiration. So we'll come out that later on. So let me draw the inspiration in blue. So this is the inspiratory limb of the pressure curve. So let us reach a point, and from here on, you have to trigger you are going to trigger an expiration. So let us assume this is the expiratory limb. So once the expiration gets over, so for some time there is no respiration happening. So again, it's going to maintain in the PEEP range. So PEEP is the, like for example, if you know what is PEEP, even though we are going to discuss in detail in the upcoming videos, PEEP is nothing but the lowest pressure that your system or the ventilator can reach in the lungs. So that is what you call it as positive index. So it's the lowest pressure that is a set pressure. So if you set at 5, the lowest pressure reached will be 5 centimeter of water. If you set at 10, the lowest pressure that will be reaching is the 10 centimeter of water. So whatever the PEEP is the lowest pressure that your system can reach in a ventilator circuit. So that is what your PEEP is all about. Second thing, if you want to know, let us see about the flow curve. So what about the flow? So if you take the flow, so flow you can draw in multiple ways, but like in my ventilator, it's something like this. So initially the no flow is happening during this phase. And again, let me draw this inspiration like this. So let me draw a square pattern of flow. So in inspiration, so this is what the flow is. Like in the early part of the inspiration, the flow increases, and in the later part of inspiration, the flow is going to decrease. So that's what I'm doing. In the early part, the inspiration, the flow is going to increase. In the later part of inspiration itself, the flow is going to reduce. So the flow is not consistent throughout the inspiration or expiration. So let us see what will happen in expiration. In expiration, the flow is going to be negative and ultimately reaching a normal range over a period of time. And it's going to maintain at a no flow range for some time before the next breath is going to start. So the next is the volume curve. So how you are going to see about the volume curve? So the volume curve, let us draw something in the x-axis and y-axis again about the volume curve. So, like in a volume curve, again, initially there is no volume that is taken on. So the patient's chest is quiet and silent. So after that, you're going to take a breath in, so which is going to be something similar to this. So they are going to reach a peak volume, and after reaching a peak volume, they are going to cycle back to expiration. So they're going to cycle back to expiration, and after that again they're going to reach a stable point before the next breath is triggered. So in this cycle you can clearly see this blue things are the inspiratory limbs, and the red things are the expiratory limbs, and the black ones are the ones where the chest is silent, no inspiration or no expiration. So this is what the basic ventilator curves which I see in my day to day in my ICU. So if you want to equate this into a like proper mechanics, so let us assume, so like you have something called inspiration which I draw in blue. So this is inspiratory curve, and next thing I can even draw something called expiratory curve. So even though this is not exactly accurate, like your expiration, as I told you, it is more than the inspiration. Usually, generally, like there are a lot of ventilator modes are there, but still, generally your expiratory curve is more than the inspiratory curve. But still, anyway, this is a little bit an arbitrary diagram which I drew. But still, anyway, hope you understand. So this is inspiration, this is expiration in a cycle of breath. So, like very well. So there is something you can see that triggers your inspiration. You can see, like this is actually quite important. So you can see something that triggers your inspiration. So that is what we are going to call it as a trigger. So this is actually quite important to understand. So this is something called trigger, which triggers your inspiration at all points. So whatever, let it be volume or pressure, or let it be flow, like there is something that triggers your, inspiration. So after triggering your inspiration, that like you cannot inspire for long. So when a patient is normal, he can inspire only up to his limit. But a patient is mechanically ventilated, like he cannot keep on inspiring for long. Lung is going to, if you put a lot of pressure and volume inside, it's going to cause a serious lung injury. So you should have a stop, like a point where it should stop. So that stop point probably, like is this. You can clearly see this is the point where your inspiration stops. The point where the inspiration stops and the expiration is triggered is what we call it as cycle. So there are two basic things you have to know about the ventilator. The first one is the trigger, and second one is the cycle. So trigger is the one which triggers the inspiration to happen, and cycle is the one which stops the inspiration and starts the expiration. So I think you get it. So about trigger, whenever you want to know about the trigger, there are two things you have to know about the trigger. So one is, like the basic triggering modes are there, and what are the things that actually trigger. So we call that types of triggers. So what are the two basic triggering modes? We call it as assist control mode. This is one of the basic triggering mode, and second basic triggering mode we call it as the pressure support mode. This is called PS. So pressure support mode is second basic triggering mode. So these are the two basic triggering modes. And what are the types of triggers? For example, you have the basic, two types of trigger are there. Number one, you have one is called mandatory trigger. So which means, let me come back to that. This is a mandatory trigger. And the second, you have something called a triggered trigger. So, like it looks quite funny, but still, what is a mandatory trigger and what is a triggered trigger? For example, whenever you have a mandatory trigger, which means no matter what, it's going to give a breath. So let me draw a curve. Let me draw two, ventilator curves that tell you whether it's a trigger breath or it's a mandatory breath. For example, so what is a triggered breath? So let us see in the pressure curve. So, like the patient's pressure generally drops, you can clearly see. So this drop in pressure, so for example, this is a pressure curve. If you take this drop in pressure is due to the inspiratory effort of the patient. So whenever the patient develops an inspiratory effort, obviously when they inspire, the intrathoracic pressure falls, and this is the dip in the pressure curve, which is telling you that the patient is taking an inspiratory effort. So this inspiratory effort, if it triggers a breath, so this is what we are going to call it as triggered breath. So an inspiratory effort of the patient is triggering the breath. So this is an triggered breath. So next, if you want to know what is mandatory breath, so I can draw a curve something like this. So, so what you're seeing here is there is no dip, which means the patient has not, like taken any inspiratory effort, but still the breath has been delivered by the ventilator. So this is what we call it as mandatory breath. So these are the two types of triggering modes, and these are the two types of triggers you have. One is the mandatory breath, and second is the triggered breath. So these are the two things you have. The triggered breath are generally triggered by the patient's inspiratory effort, and mandatory breath is something mandatory. There is no trigger from the patient side. There is no inspiratory effort. Still, the ventilator delivers the breath. So that is what we call mandatory ventilation. So what about the cycling? So this is also quite important. So cycling, you have basically three types of cycling. You have something called volume cycling. So that is what we call it as VC. You generally use this volume cycling in access control modes. That's why we call it as ACVC, which means what do you mean by cycling? For example, in access control volume cycling mode, the stoppage point is the volume. For example, the inspiration will continue. For example, if you set a volume at 450 ml of tidal volume, the ventilator will deliver a breath until it reaches 450 ml. So after that, the expiration will start. So that is what the volume cycling is all about. So second one, we call it as time cycling. Time cycling. So usually again, this time cycling, we use it in access control modes, usually in a pressure control modes. So in a pressure control, access controlled ventilation. So that's what we call ACPC. So you have something called time. For example, in this, you deliver a ventilator breath up to a set pressure, and this set pressure is maintained for a particular amount of time. So that's what we call time cycling. So usually use it in access control and pressure control as ACPC modes. And the third thing, you call it as something called flow cycling. So in flow cycling, usually you use it in pressure support ventilation, which we discuss later on. So this is usually use this flow cycling in pressure control. Typically, it is like the cycling will alternate at 25% of the once the 25% flow is reached, but still that's different. That's something complicated which you don't need. But still, anyway, so volume cycling, time cycling, and flow cycling. These are the three cycling modes. What is like volume cycling? So again, we let us have a look on that. A set volume. Once that volume is reached, you're going to stop the inspiration and start the expiration. So what is pressure cycling? So you reach a set pressure, maintain that pressure for a particular amount of time. Then once you maintain that pressure for a particular amount of time, stop the inspiration and start the expiration. And in flow cycling, once a flow reaches a set limit, for example, 25% of the maximum flow is reached or whatever it is. So once you reach the set flow, the ventilator will stop the inspiration and start the expiration. So these are the three cycling modes. So again, once again, so this is what the basics of today. So I have discussed in this video about the indications of mechanical ventilation. Second is oxygenation versus ventilation, and third is the basic ventilator curves and how to interpret and what is a respiratory cycle and how you analyze the different, like what do you mean by a trigger and what do you mean by a cycle, and what are the different trigger modes and what are the types of triggers and what are the different types of cycling methods. So this is all about today's Dr. MS Weekly. And in the next episode, we'll be discussing more on the ventilator modes. And until that, thank you very much and bye bye. See you all.